I hate to research this. I hate to write about this. But most of all, I hate to think about this. Human population. Its unnatural growth, our present vast and unsustainable numbers, and the greatest mind-bender of all, that the things that are essential to do, we will absolutely not do, and the resulting certainty of consequences for which there are no words. Before beginning this discussion, there is the matter of how to report the numbers associated with birth rate. One is as numbers like the replacement rate of 2.1 to 2.3 births per female. This is the number of births from one female to replace statistically one female and one male. This measure is only informative in multi-generational terms, and it hides the death rate in its construction. The other is the percentage change in population per year. For example, world population is added to today at something a bit under 2% per year, somewhat less than 20 new people per thousand per year, and subtracted from at something a little under 1% a year. A bit under 10 people, all ages and causes, die per thousand per year. I will be largely using percentage changes here. This essay on population is the fourth in the series looking at a lifestyle. Overconsumption and overpopulation underlie every environmental problem we face. Jacques Cousteau from the last century. If we don't halt population growth with justice and compassion, it will be done for us by nature without pity, and will leave a ravaged world. Henry Kendall, Nobel laureate in physics from the last century. The power of population is indefinitely greater than the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man. Thomas Malthus from 200 years ago. The issue of human population, fundamentally the only real issue when you think about it, is absolutely clear. It shouldn't be necessary to explain why our thousand-fold increases in the last few millennia create the forces behind essentially all of our human concerns and dilemmas, including the increases in technological discoveries and implementations, chicken and egg to population growth. But while we know that populations have grown to really beyond dangerous levels, there is still a lack of clarity as to how to respond. Here are broadly the two different views of how populations will and need to change over this century. One view is that there is a natural demographic process that will reduce population. This process is thought to be seen in the lowered population growth rates over the last half-century. While population is continuing to markedly increase, the percentage increases have been getting smaller, with the more or less linear projection that the growth rate will go to zero between 2080 and 2100 at populations between 9 and 12 billion, depending on a number of factors, at which point the population will, in theory, gradually get smaller. The explicit assumption is that by some invisible hand process based in civilization, education, shifts in human understanding and values, with no other interventions, human population will reduce and stabilize. And then the second argument, which data and reason increasingly favors, that the present population is at least twice and more likely 4 to 8 times sustainable levels, that there is near certainty that the result of present and future increases will be cascading waves of environmental, economic, social, and political failures in the next few decades, long before any meaningful reductions can be seen from the natural demographic process. Further, so-called natural demographic changes are far from natural, which can be seen in the human exponential growth process of the last several thousand years. Historically, birth rate and death rate were very nearly equal. Death rate was determined primarily by environmental factors, and birth rates adapted to death rate. For thousands of years, humans' 4 to 5% death rates were supported by 4+ to 5+ % birth rates, resulting in a world population in the late Paleolithic of several 100,000 humans gradually increasing, even as death rates and birth rates began to fall, to perhaps 5 million 10,000 years ago, to about 300 million 1,000 years ago. This would be remarkable, utterly unprecedented for a large species of omnivore to increase populations from about 300,000 to 300 million in the space of only 20,000 years or so. Such population growth had only ever happened rarely and locally as part of boom and bust population changes in small, rapidly breeding organisms. Yet there wasn't to be a bust. The 300 million 1,000 years ago became 2 billion, that is 2,000 million, in less than 1,000 years, in about 1925. Then the 2 billion became 5 billion in 50 years, about 1980. Then 8 billion in 2020, headed toward 10 billion in 2050. The rate of increasing was slowing, but still dramatically increasing total numbers. What must be realized is that this is not any kind of natural population growth. It has no evolutionary, natural history complement, and yet the individual organisms require all the natural basic life-sustaining conditions of environmental services. In natural populations, rapid population growth is allowed and driven by high birth rates and low death rates, supported by ample supplies of biological necessities. Then a process inevitably follows that responds to necessities being used up by the increasing population numbers, reduced birth rate, increased death rate, and a return to an adapted equilibrium of environmental conditions and species numbers. Human population growth hasn't followed this pattern for about 20 to 30,000 years, with the greatest deviations coming in the last 200 years. A whole new population change model is required just for us. But let us be clear, this is not a discovery of some new and remarkable demographic process. It is a model for population behaviors of an unnatural population process with 1 foot in biology and 1 foot in the exceptional capacities evolved within, particularly Homo sapiens, that have exploded onto the world as an absolutely new way of doing the living business. This model is called demographic transition and is presented as a demographic tool explaining and predicting human population change as if it were just another process to be described with some increasing mathematical precision by cool and dispassionate population model builders. But the demographic transition model is really a response to an extremely abnormal population growth process that has become disconnected from the biological forces that control species numbers. Yes, it is a process that can be described in mathematical model terms, but that in no way should be seen as normalizing the process. We must recognize the growth in human numbers as unnatural and our huge numbers as producing behaviors that are dangerously at odds with the survival of the biophysical systems that allow life on this planet. Population change is simplicity itself. Increase birth rate while decreasing death rate and population numbers increase. We have been doing this for thousands of years. Decrease birth rate and increase death rate and population numbers decrease. But after that bit of simplicity, there are few parts of human life more fraught with issues of sober practicality, combined with issues of subjective, fanciful, and fanatical belief, and the very essence of biological motive. There is a fundamental and terrible difference between birth rate and death rate. One involves bringing or not bringing something into existence, and the other involves removing something that has established itself in existence. Though this distinction gets muddied in human societies by biology and belief. First, a cold-eyed look at birth rates. Human females typically produce one child at a time and very often give that child 2 or more years of attention before becoming pregnant again. If a large percentage of women were empowered and educated to their capacity to control fecundancy, and if, especially, they limited themselves on average to one child, the most basic element of birth rate reduction would be met. There are a number of conditions that would support this general goal. Generally passive conditions. 1. Improved, broad-based education of especially females. 2. Social expectations for the age of first pregnancy to correspond with true emotional maturity. 3. Widely available and social approval of contraceptive methods for females and males. 4. Unlimited access to abortion services. 5. Clear routes to economic independence for females. 6. Social structures empowering females to fundamental human equality. There are also potential coercive methods to which humans have on occasion resorted. 1. Reducing the number of fertile females. 2. Active social and legal prohibitions to reproduction. 3. Economic penalties for having children. 4. Forced sterilization of males and females. If population numbers are to decline in meaningful time frames, present birth rates need to be reduced well below replacement. This would be required, 1, given that time frames for population reduction are narrowing with each new discovery of our environmental impact, and 2, taking into account population momentum, also called demographic momentum, that absolute birth numbers continue to remain the same or increase for a generation or more as present populations of juvenile females reach reproductive age, and death rates remain well below birth rates. Worldwide birth rate average is presently 1.6 to 1.7%, a 1.6% increase in total population per year by numbers of births, a number which varies significantly by region and nation. These are the base figures that produce the business-as-usual projections for population increases across the 21st century. An in-depth analysis by the PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, looking at essentially all reasonable possible non-catastrophic scenarios, makes clear that even with various stringent reductions in birth rate alone, meaningful population reduction over the coming century is unlikely to happen. Without uncommon action, world population will continue to increase with the foreseeable consequences of larger and larger numbers of people enduring greater deprivation and suffering as environmental systems fail and humans respond violently to the loss of life-sustaining conditions. The PNAS analysis considered a variety of plausible scenarios: age ranges, unintended versus intended pregnancies, influence of demographic momentum, enforced birth limitations, and others. Going on as we are presently would produce populations of 10 billion or more by 2050, and as many as 12 billion by 2100. What the study called realistic changes in rates produced populations of over 9 billion in 2050 and 10.5 billion or more by 2100. Draconian fertility reduction in rates produced almost 9 billion in 2050 and almost 7 billion in 2100. A scenario of enforced worldwide one-child policy and no increased survivability over present levels produced a population of about 7.6 billion in 2050 and about 3.5 billion in 2100. A variety of projections between these extremes were obtained by minor tweaking of the scenarios in different ways. One interesting finding was that even large acute catastrophic population reductions by typical pandemic disease or other significant acute conflagration were largely inconsequential to the major demographic movements of population change. Such rapid short-term increases in death rates showed only brief population reductions, while the percentage increases soldiered on. Death rate. The uncomfortable conclusion is that increasing of death rate will have to be looked at in the immediate future. The continued lowering of death rates is the major driver of population increases. Birth rates have been very slightly higher than death rates for a very long time. But as birth rates began to decline in the last century, death rates were dropping even faster, from approximately a 2% death rate in 1950 to less than a 1% death rate today. It is clear, though, that any systematic action on death rate would be met with considerable discomfort, since the fundamental action would be to withhold life-saving procedures and technologies based on politically arrived-at principles. Proposing death rate changes would have many fraught ramifications throughout society. For example, 1. The distribution of dying is spread disproportionately among nations across age, ethnicity, class, and other social divisions. 2. There are many causes of death, both passive and active. And 3. A very large part of economic activity is directly dependent on maintaining the living and avoiding dying. And the living today are completely dependent on economic activity. At present, the total death rate worldwide is 0.7 to 0.8% per year. 7 or 8 people per 1,000 die per year, though widely variable by region and nation. Again, this is the base beginning number for business as usual calculations of population changes over the century. Given the above bullet points, it is clear why most of the arguments and potential efforts of population reduction concern lowering birth rate. The only change that the PNAS report can offer about death rate is no increase in survivability across one of the scenarios, meaning that advancing medical options and other interventions would not be used to increase the death rate. It should also be noted that focusing on birth rate places both the active and passive controls of population very largely onto females, whereas societal action to manage an increasing death rate would equally be a responsibility of males. Historically, death rates have been outsourced to environmental and natural actions: diseases, accidents, starvation, conflicts, predation, and finally aging out. Death rates over most of our history have varied around 4 to 5%, with corresponding slightly higher birth rates closely tracking. But these environmental actions have become increasingly, directly or indirectly, influenced by human intervention. There would be great temptation to stand back and let such outsourcing be the method of increasing death rates. We seem to be seeing that happening to a small extent today. But there would be no equity or justice should that be our method. The people pushed to the margins by first world growth would experience the first and greatest increase in death rate. The major human response to death rate has been to reduce it, at least within our own societies. Such reductions are considered among our crowning achievements, but now that effort seems to be falling under the no good deed goes unpunished category. Without the worldwide developing of more realistic expectations about death, there is increasingly the likelihood that billions of people will be condemned to terrible suffering as inaction empowers all the historical outsourcing of mortality. Estimates vary, but are all in the same direction. The Earth can sustainably support somewhere less than 1 and no more than 4 billion people, with the strongest arguments centering on 1 to 2 billion. And we do not have unlimited time to get to those numbers. In fact, it seems that a combination of environmental degradation and the dangers that we represent to ourselves as we vie for advantage in a world of declining survivability suggest that substantive changes must be made in the next few decades. Assuming that such projections have a high probability of being correct, it means that death rate will have to be increased. Reducing birth rate alone in any responsible way will not be sufficient. There are people in power thinking about these numbers, we can be sure. If death rate is, over the next decade, doubled from 0.8% to 1.6%, and the birth rate is reduced from 1.6% to about 1%, and is maintained at these numbers, then world population will be about 6.3 billion in 2050, 5 billion in 2080, and less than 4 billion in 2100. This is assuming relatively benign world events over that period. Major conflagrations involving WMD or high mortality pandemics would change the projections. With reducing populations and the possible successful economic and social adaptations to the reductions, the world's ecological systems and human systems would have a better chance of stabilizing at sustainable levels. Though without certainty, even greater reductions in numbers and total impact may be required. If we cannot eventually adapt to reducing population numbers and the economic changes associated with reduced consumption, then the survival of present social and ecological systems would be in serious doubt. I have built spreadsheets for population change, of birth rates, of death rates organized by age, causes of death, income, and other variables, have looked at death rates over the last several decades, at death rates of the world's nations and regions. No matter how the numbers are manipulated, there is one simple conclusion. If the death rate is doubled from 0.8% to 1.6%, more than 60 million people will die each year than would otherwise. A 0.8% death rate results in about 64 million deaths per year given a population of 8 billion. Doubling the death rate would double that number. Manipulating the numbers only distributes those additional deaths in different ways among different demographics. We could look at it all this way. About 8 people in 1,000 die per year now. 16 people in 1,000 would die per year with the increase. The reason that the totals would work out to be approximately 60 million more deaths is, of course, that there are so many of us now. Cutting through the swamp of fantasy, fallacy, and fearfulness of death, all the arguments of religion, morality, economics, politics, and personal individual rights, we are left with the simple biology-ecology imperative that death is part of a species' adaptation to its ecosystem. It is fundamentally unworkable in any system of reality to see death as a biological adaptation to be avoided at all costs. Just as a species has rates of renewal, it must have rates of removal appropriate to its relationship with its environment. One reasonable summary of our present condition is that humans must die in greater numbers than it is in our capacity to prevent. There is a draconian sound to such a statement, but it actually presents us with no greater problem than many others that we already deal with. We distribute society's wealth in ruinous ways. We assign selected demographics to die in wars and other dangers. We withhold medical and other life-saving interventions for a plethora of economic, social, and practical reasons. It is not so much that practical methods to accomplish these changes are just unthinkably inhuman, simply can't be done. Rather, our attitudes toward death and therefore life itself need changing. A not at all unthinkable proposal, since these attitudes have often been, many times throughout history, very different than at present. It is time for this discussion to be had openly and honestly in the public forum, along with a basket of other related existential issues. The failure to recognize the utterly dominating role of an unsustainable and growing human population on all the increasing dangers that we and the living world face will only ensure our most apocalyptic projections for the future. Reducing the birth rate below replacement, approximately 2.1 births per female, will absolutely reduce population. Everyone eventually dies. But with our great numbers operating with demographic momentum, population will continue to increase for a few generations, even with birth rates well below replacement. 2, population numbers greatly beyond sustainable levels, both socially and ecologically, is the fundamental issue in literally all human difficulties. Difficulties that can only be addressed by reducing our numbers. And 3, increasing death rates is the only way to reduce population quickly enough to avoid catastrophic population reduction, driven by both environmental and social political failures. Such failures, of course, result from population stresses in the first place. With the increasing clarity that death rate as well as birth rate needs to be part of the discussion of population reduction over the next several decades, a variety of problems must be confronted. Humanity has long had as its only response to death the generalized goal of reducing death rate. The thought and reality of needing to increase death rate by societal action and expectation is anathema. However, there are clear arguments to be made and options that can be considered within the bounds of humane values. Vastly more troubling are long-standing arguments and actions driven by xenophobia, racism, eugenics, classism, and other self-serving and dehumanizing attitudes and beliefs. Combining such attitudes with the increasing concerns about how nations will change economically, socially, and militarily as populations decrease, creates demands to increase population. And we will see these attitudes and arguments grow and bloom like the flowers of the desert after a flooding rain. There will be a great pressure against any collective effort by humanity's leaders and influencers to honestly consider increasing death rate. How to effectively respond to these deeply ingrained elements of human nature would be the greatest challenge to honest, open discussion and action, allowing non-catastrophic though rapid reduction in population to sustainable levels. Issues of the greatest concern are before us. Whether we are to take reasoned, democratic approaches, or are we to do nothing and let our future survival be outsourced to the great ecological, social, and political failures that will surely follow? If we are fortunate enough to act with some level of responsibility, we must make every effort to avoid the prejudices of racism, nationalism, ideological certainties, and the eugenics of a narrow scientism. And then, with the clear understanding that the life lived is what is to be valued, that for the human animal, to make not dying the preeminent goal is not life at all.